Welcome again, everyone. And this podcast, we're going to be talking to Mairi Sutherland, who is an independent filmmaker. She got in touch with us asking if we'd like to talk to her about, well, in the end, we talked about lots of things. About 20 years ago, she made a film called The Red Rose, which is about Robbie Burns and part of his life. It doesn't cover the whole of his life. So we had her on, and in the end had a really fascinating conversation, I thought.
It was quite a wide-ranging conversation, and she's actually just had quite an interesting life. Almost fell into films by accident, as she describes it, and then how she spent 20 years as an independent filmmaker. She's been over in Hollywood for a bit. She's done a lot of Scottish films. She's worked with theatres, and this film, The Red Rose, although it was 20 odd years old, it's still finding audiences. So this is one of the reasons she came on to talk to us. But we don't just talk about that. We talk about the Scottish film industry. We talk about successful projects like the Outlander series, projects she's got on the go, like Western with Scottish cowboys in it. So sure, whether you like history, films or Burns, you'll find something in this that you'll enjoy. Hello, welcome to our guest, Mairi Sutherland. I'm delighted to have you with us, Mairi. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from Dumfries and Galloway. I'm quite old now. I've worked in the film industry for 20 years as an independent film producer, which is very, very different from the Hollywood model. Prior to ending up accidentally helping to run a film company in 1995, I had been working with the BBC Radio Solway down in Dumfries and Galloway, as a trainee reporter. And then I moved to Glasgow to do a course. And that ended up with me actually working in a year with Clan Wallace, the film fighters of Braveheart. So after the radio experience where I knew about sound, or at least capturing it, I learned a lot more about production, background action stuff for drama, albeit as a runner. And then I got the chance of becoming a shareholder in a company called Palm Tree, which was run by an auteur-style film director and writer Robbie Moffat in Glasgow. So accidentally I ended up, part of a film company, and I stuck it for 20 years. And in that period made, I would say, over 21 independent films, sometimes on very low budget. So Red Rose was not on a big budget, and it had to rely on a lot of kind of volunteer input for some of the extras and the locations and the background action for the camera. Well, I was greatly influenced by during the time that I worked as a volunteer stroke job creation scheme for Clan Wallace, who were film fighters for Braveheart, but they were also training people in Scotland in film production skills. And they did that on a regular basis. And I think that's how they got the Braveheart gig. As a result of that experience, I felt that the next film to write about Scottish subject matter, after the likes of Braveheart and Rob Roy, which it was a strange year in 1994, because two major films came out about Scottish history. After my year, which I was only allowed to be on it for a year, I then decided to learn to write a screenplay about Robert Burns. I was obviously, as a producer by then, working with Robbie and working with his material because he had written loads of novels. And I said to him, well, why didn't he write them into screenplays? So he did that. And I worked with him with over, I would say, 12 to 15 films that were all historical based. And it took me a while to write Red Rose. Actually, it took about 5 years because I was working in between. And so that's how we ended up doing historical materials because I was interested in that, but I also realised that there was international interest in Scottish history by then, and there were a lot of untold stories. And I discovered the story about Robert Burns as I did the research. There was definitely something to say about what had happened to him and why he died so early at the age of 37. But the other, just very quickly, the other films that we made, yes, they were all historical. Robbie had written a novel about the Scottish subject matter of St Kentigern and St Mungo. I read quite a bit of it. It was quite a tome. And I take my hat off to him that he wrote that in his early 20s with a bit of passion, I think, for Scottish history. But it ended up in the cupboard because it never got published. And I realised that there was a story there about St Kentigern in that period of the kings of Strathclyde. And so he invented a character, a warrior called Fingal. And it was set in the 5th century. And that story went on to do 3 films, like a trilogy. And the second one was quite, audiences quite liked that because it was about bringing the bones of St Andrew to Scotland. And it was based on the real story of what happened to the relics and how they got to Scotland. We were looking at historical Scottish things. Robert Burns, because I'm from Dumfries, I was born in Dumfries, I knew about the stories of Robert Burns and the places he visited. So it wasn't a hard ask to write that screenplay, given that, you know, that was my background. My father was actually an SNP councillor, and he used to do the poetry for Robert Burns nights, you know. Burns Suppers. So I was brought up with them, learning all this. But I also worked in the museum in Dumfries, and there they have a collection of very rare personal effects of Robert Burns, from things like his specs, his sword for when he was working with the excise, the tax inspector later in his life, and also a lock of his hair, which was grey. And I was only 17 when I was working there, and I looked at all these personal effects of Robert Burns, and I felt at that time that there was something about his hair. And I then went on to tell that story, which is, of course, connected with the true facts that he died of mercury poisoning.
Oh, know that.
Yes, and so that is the key element of the film script and the actual story of the film at the end of it. Yes, he died of mercury poisoning because his Dr. Maxwell accidentally, or as I kind of write, on purpose, because I had to create a bit of intrigue, you know, artistic license, accidentally on purpose gives him mercury, but it had also, they had thought at that time, was a cure-all for certain diseases that they felt were incurable, and they had to stop giving it to King George III because it was allegedly making him go mad, although he was not quite right, allegedly anyway. But so that was the story I told about it. But also, even if there wasn't an intrigue, you know, to do with that, which may have just been a pure accident of lack of knowledge by Dr. Maxwell, who was a friend of his, then I also put the point as well that he died of a heart attack, which was to do with his history of working in the farms. And when they exhumed his body, I think it was in 1834, they discovered that they thought he had brucellosis, which is very similar to tuberculosis, which he would have got from the cows. So he would have caught that in childhood, really. So that, because it caused rheumatic fever, would have contributed. And the two things together mercury and his own predisposition led to his death at 37. But I also then put the point that the times he was living in also helped to carry him off earlier than he would have.
You said something interesting there about that, or a phrase that you used, which was there are stories to be told. And we do some historical stuff. And the point keeps coming up that in Scotland, we're not taught our own history. And these stories, they're out there. But actually, a lot of people don't know them. The whole bit about his career as an exciseman and the sort of hint of government intrigue, I didn't know anything about that. And coming to it without knowing a lot of the story, I found it a little bit hard to follow in places because of my lack of knowledge. Can you tell us a bit more about the sort of the politics of the day and how that impacted on his life?
When the Theatre Royal Dumfries agreed to a screening, which was ostensibly for, it was hosted this year on the 21st of July by the Indie Group in Dumfries, they actually had asked me for the permission, very nice of them, as a producer. The chair or one of the people in that group had seen Red Rose. One of the other things I do is I'm an artist, so occasionally, a couple of years ago, I was selling my wares, if you like, cards, greeting cards, and actually, copies of Red Rose were there on this stall. And she looked at the DVD, because it is available on DVD in Amazon, by the way. You can buy a DVD of it still after 20 years. But also now, this year, it's come back on Apple TV and also on Amazon. So, I think you can stream it in quite a few sites, the main one being Apple TV, and it's available in Apple TV UK, North America and Australia. So the main sort of like English-speaking Scottish heritage countries, if you like, have brought it back. So as a result, I've started to look at, screening it this year in Scotland. So I had a screening of it, not just at Dumfries Theatre Royal, but another arts cinema, well, a very small cinema there, theatre, has screened it too. And so I'm looking for other opportunities to do that. So there is a lot of interest in the film, and I think a lot of people are aware of the story, but not the minutiae details. So it is a surprise when they realise, when they watch the film, about all the things that happened to Robert Burns. You're right, it's not readily known that he had such trouble. People think of him just as this Cailliad guy who is womanizing, and that he might have got a lot of money for what he did. In actual fact, he died in poverty. And this, I felt, was what needed to be shown, was that truthfully, you mentioning the difficulties of Scottish history, a lot of things are skimmed over, even in schools, and the full picture is not told about how difficult it was for people like Robert Burns just to have a say, and how back in the day during the French Revolution, I think it was the first stab that the British, the government realised they had to be scared of the people. And it was a frightening time for them. It was called Pitt's Terror. So the film is set during that, when the government was rounding up anybody that may have wanted to have joined the French Guard and supported the likes of Robespierre. But that went sour in France, because after all, instead of concentrating on power to the people, they started to go for the aristocracy. This really frightened everyone in Britain, and they started rounding up people like Wadsworth, who was a contemporary of Robert Burns, and then Robert Burns would have been next. But fortunately for him, he worked as a tax collector. So he was able to leverage that, if you like, and, said he was sorry and everything. But the reason that the Theatre Royal said yes is because there was the event that was associated with Robert Burns' life that was to change his life and make things very, very difficult for him thereafter. And probably contributed to his early death is that he, during the opening night of the Theatre Royal Dumfries, of which he was invited to do one of the poems, and he had written for that evening a special poem, The Rights of Women, that was put forward by the then famous actress, Miss Fontanelle. And things went okay at the beginning of that event, but then suddenly after the As You Like It, which was, the play by Shakespeare, the audience had to say, kind of had to do the regular thing, which was say the anthem to King George at the time. And it didn't go very well, because what happened is that Robert Burns decided, I think he had maybe misjudged the atmosphere, but not with the common people, obviously. He hadn't misjudged that. He sat down for the national anthem. He didn't stand up. Yes, and this sparked, obviously, I mean, we think that's common nowadays, but back then that was practically a seditious thing to do. Mm. A lot of people in Scotland who are SNP, or, you'll see them at the tattoo when the anthem comes up in Edinburgh, and they don't stand, and nobody is looking round and booing at them or making any judgment, because I think we live in a democracy now, but we have to thank people like Robert Burns for that, actually, in his poetry that was very much about one man, one vote, the common people, etc. Yeah. But anyway, let's go back to the theatre and why they screened it this year. That event took place there, where after he refused to stand for the national anthem, there was a riot. And the common people, yes, all true, by the way. And little known, not, as you are right, not described in a lot of the accessible history books about them. But the Theatre Royal knew that, because they're doing a special tours now about the history of the theatre, because it's the oldest theatre in Scotland. So it comes with a bit of pedigree. And and it was set up in 1792 during the height on the start of the French Revolution. So it was a difficult time for a theatre to start. So once the riot kicked off, the common people, the rabble, if you like, started singing Ça ira. And Ça ira is the song of the French Revolution, which is basically, it was a challenge. So after that, they tried to clamp down and crack down on Robert Burns, because they realised they couldn't have him speaking to the common people, because his ideas might incite them to further behaviour like that. So after that, it was very difficult. It was put to him by his bosses, the excise bosses. It was his job, it was his family, or it was his poetry. Once something had to give, something was going to go. And he did have a chance to escape it, because Maria Riddell, I'm telling the plot to the film.
It's all right.
That's okay.
Anyway, but it's so complicated. I don't want to carry on with that, because that's one of the side stories that comes out in the film. And how it all sort of weaves into each other.
Yeah. Who was Maria Riddell?
Well, she was an aristocrat who had taken to Robert Burns. Like many, he did have a lot of lovers, and you know, female sidekicks. It was never truly verified if he had a relationship with her, and many of the others like Jean Lorimer and Clorinda. Yes, I think it was probably likely, given the amount of poems that were written between him and Clorinda. That one sounds like it would be plausible. But obviously the thing is, he was playing to the audience. So there's a bit of an actor, if you like, in Robert Burns, in that obviously the theatre show at the Theatre Royal shows that he had an aspect, he knew that he had to dramatise things. So a lot of his love poetry is dramatised. But Maria was the one who, at the end of his life, tried to save his life. And she also tried to help out by petitioning a few people in government about what had happened, you know, what was happening with him. And she tried to get my job with the Evening Chronicle in London. Now, what's interesting is he could have had that job, but instead of doing that, he decided that Jean needed his help, and his 9 children, of which he had by then, needed his pension as an exciseman. So he opted to carry on, and that may have contributed to his death, because if he had become a journalist and writer for the Evening Chronicle in London, he might have had a longer life. So it tries to look at all the real reasons as to why. You know, some of it was his own choice, where he was obviously realising that he couldn't abandon his children. His children couldn't end up in poverty the way that he was.
You have lots of scenes with militia and people whipping swords out and what have you. And we did a couple of episodes on the 1820 uprising, and the same thing came through there, just how militarised Scotland was. And it must have felt as if there was an occupying force. But when you see it on the film, it's much more powerful. Was that deliberate?
Yes, I knew that. I have a degree, I have a BA degree in history. And of course, at school, I studied firstly medieval history, and then my degree was a joint degree. So I had history and politics. But my history part of it was a dissertation on the social and response to industrialization, which was, you know, the 1750 elements, and that included the Inclusion Act. Obviously, it would have also involved elements of the Jacobite rebellion, because the Inclusion Act, which happened in 1750, was basically what was a nice name for putting sheep on farms. And that was the thing that then created the economic dislocation of Scotland, because obviously land was being taken. I mean, there's an argument that the Jacobite rebellion was just a distraction from the real thing, which was to remove the land from the Highlanders and claw it back and change the use of that land to sheep and cattle. And they did it, and of course the social and artistic response to industrialization were people like Robert Burns, Byron, and all the early Romantic poets who realised that there is an tension between the economic and the political. And I think by 1792, when the film kicks off, it's clear that they would have had to maintain that power after the Inclusion Act and the sheep and Culloden, which was only 1746, don't forget. They would have had to maintain that by force. And because you had things like Thomas Moore, who was trying to set up a parliament for the people in Edinburgh during the time of the life of Robert Burns, then, you know, the whole thing was going to have to be that the Redcoats, as we know it, but they were the British Army, had to come in and occupy Scotland. And in fact, Dumfries, which was in the border country, was taken over by army barracks during that period.
Something I learned from our local archaeologist who was talking about ordnance survey maps. there's a clue in the name. That's where all the military ordnance was all around the country. That's where it comes from. I thought, I didn't know that. I'd never made that connection. But again, that just shows you what a huge factor of life it must have been.
If you look at the maps, you will see that in Dumfries and Galloway and on the way to Inverness, there is a thing called the Old Military Road.
Mm-hmm. General Wade, wasn't it?
Yeah, were used. Often they were Roman roads and they were very straight, but the Old Military Road up to Inverness was used to prevent any kind of residual rebellions by the Highlanders, you know, in case they fought back.
Yeah, indeed. So it's 20 years on from when the film was. What, you know, how do you feel about it now as you look, you know, as you watch it? And, you know, do you think you might have done it a bit differently, or do you think it's still got a value?
Obviously, it was done on a low budget. You know, if it was done again, I would love to have a higher budget to tell that story. I think it's the story that gets people rather than how it was made or the execution of the acting or the thing. I think it's story driven. I would love to have seen it remade. You know, it would be great to maybe sell on the remake rights and have it properly made in Hollywood. I regret that. I mean, there is a story. I did pitch it to Hollywood, and I was a bit naive in that they were interested, and the company who wanted to look at the script and develop it more, because no script is perfect, you know, on a first draft, was Bob Chartoff in Los Angeles, and he was known for Casino and the Rocky movies, 1 to 5. So I ended up, I was lucky, I managed to get an agent. I don't have a literary agent now, which I should have, but at that point I had one. And he was able to make the introduction to Bob Chartoff. And I worked for a year with Lynn Hindy, who was the development officer. And there's a version of Red Rose, which is their interest in Robert Burns, which actually I didn't understand their point of view. They didn't like his womanizing, so they wanted that all taken out of the story. And eventually, after a year of working with them, I realized as a Scottish person and somebody, you know, who wanted to write the truth about Robert Burns, I couldn't take out elements of his life, even the bad things. Like, for example, in the film and in true life, he got, for example, Annie Park pregnant, and Jean Armour gets to know about it, and she takes the child into her own home and looks after that child. Now that's truthful. That's what happened. But Hollywood didn't like that. So, yeah, I know. So although I had my break, if I had said to them, yes, I'm happy that they make a kind of, although I wouldn't have used these words, but in my head I was thinking Hollywood style, sterilized version of Robert Burns, then I think it would have been made and I would have been paid a handsome fee. I certainly wouldn't have been allowed to produce it. Somebody, you know, obviously he would have produced it, and it would have been directed by actually John Boorman. So that was my break. But because at the time I was naive and I didn't really understand all the, you know, the background to it.
Is that the only choice then? A low budget indie film, or you have to go to Hollywood? Is there nothing by the way of Scottish film industry at all? Is that the choice?
Fiona, that's a very, very good question, and everything is on point. I wish it was the case that there could be an in-between type film that isn't either Hollywood or low-budget indie. There is a thing called the government-funded film, which would be around about 3 to 5 million. That's a lot of money now to raise post what we now call the new distribution, which is subscription distribution via people like Netflix and Amazon, where a whole swathe of distribution has left the building. In other words, 20 years ago, it was easier to make Red Rose than it would be now,
Right.
because as an independent, raising the pre-sales in subscription fees is not a viable model for film. So everybody's complaining about that, and writers, you know, the writer's strike and the actor's strike was in Hollywood was all to do with this change in the economy. So there is an in-betweeny film, but that involves Scottish government or British government funding, which is where you apply to Creative Scotland. And at the moment, as you know, there's another review that happened with Creative Scotland where they removed funding from artists, and the knock-on effect is that affected writers too. So the problem is that can be open to whatever government needs to do at the time, and if they don't have the money, then there's not enough in the pot to support films. So there are very few films that are made in middle budget, and the rest of them, it's either attract a Hollywood actor or good investors, if you're good at that. I'm only really learning properly now, and I'm long in the tooth. I was a production manager and writer, and I learned a bit of directing. So I've directed 2 feature films in Scotland. All of my films have been Scottish in some way or form, because I just felt, because of my background, and I think also being a history graduate, I just felt it was easier to look at things that were biographical rather than make up fictional characters. Now I think it's difficult times to try to categorise how films are made, because it seems as though there's different ways to do it, and it's quite difficult to access that at the moment. I mean, there are people who are lucky who went viral or who made money online and all the rest of it. But what is tending to happen is that it's all very polarised, so nobody speaks to each other. You know, if they have money, they're putting it into their own thing. So that, you know, it's self-funded millionaires who are making films.
Don't TV companies themselves? I mean, the BBC makes, you know, feature-length films, and then there's, you know, Film 4, and I mean, is that...
That is a possibility. I mean, I'm looking at trying to make applications on a script I've written about the filmmaker Jenny Gilbertson. But these applications are complex, so you have to have everything created, the script, the shooting schedule, which can often be very difficult, because if you've got different drafts of your script and they haven't settled on it, you then need to change that schedule. And also you need a distributor behind you if you're going to make a public application. So it's not like a freebie. It's not like you can phone up the head of Creative Scotland and say, I've got this really great idea, support me. And they would come up with funding within a week's time. I think the public have got a misapprehension on that. A lot of films take a long time. They did a study on Creative Scotland for producers, and it was an article, I think it was the Herald, a journalist had looked into it, and he said that Creative Scotland were the hardest group, if you were a producer, to apply for funding for, because of the status of the application that made the producer jump hoops, you know, where they had to provide all this information and almost have made parts of the film, at least, you know, on paper, before the application was made. And that article, I think, showed that producers were actually suffering burnout from having to do a 3-month application process. And they were missing things because they couldn't run their companies and do the applications at the same time. I suffer from that. I would have to make a choice. Do I make a film, like I'm doing a documentary about wildflowers, and I'm doing documentaries, other documentaries, just to keep my hand in, you know, small things while I'm actually writing But I have my own company called Sampur Productions, which is in French, translated as without fear, it means, which is the Clan Sutherland motto. And I thought I'm going to base it on that because so many of the films were Scottish. But so far it hasn't made anything. But I'm writing a Western based on the Scottish cowboys who went out there in the 1880s, ostensibly for the gold rush, and then discovered that everything was chaos. And my character that I'm basing this on ends up a sheep herder, a cattle herder, around at the same time as the Battle of Bighorn.
Yeah.
But it's mainly to do with the Gaelic people who went there. So it is, again, it's intrinsically Scottish. I have co-producers for this project, which is called Lone Teepee. And they couldn't believe that there was such a thing as Gaelic Scottish cowboys who worked on the open trails, and they were trailblazers because Jimmy Chisholm was half Scottish. He was a Chisholm, and he was half Cherokee. So, you know, there is this story, but nobody believes it because they disbelieve Scottish history. It couldn't have happened, you know.
It does sound like there's a lot of possible scripts that you could be, you know, you could be getting on with. I mean, that's why that sounds great. I mean, I would go and see that. I mean, what do you think yourself of? Actually, I've never seen Outlander, so I don't know what it's like. But what do you kind of feel about the ones that do end up being produced and that involves Scots in some way or other?
I think any producer, any company that makes a movie has got to be congratulated because it's so hard to get it right and find the funding. I think that Sony and Stars, the companies that make Outlander, it's great. I mean, it's a brilliant thing because actually they have been very faithful to some of the stories that came out about the Jacobite rebellion. And often the kind of heartrending stuff that comes across about that. The actor who plays Jamie Fraser is brilliant at it, Sam Hogan. And I think the cast and crew, albeit that there's an American influence, have obviously, the writer has done her homework. So I take my hat off to the writers who've made Outlander and continue to create it. Although I think by now it's kind of worn out, the whole go back in time thing. That's very overused at the moment in a lot of shows, by the way. So it's difficult, I think, once they've told the initial story of Scottish history. But I love it that he's a Fraser. My middle name is Fraser. So I'm Mairi Sutherland. So I have a lot of Frasers we couldn't find that go back to the 1745. Because don't forget, a lot of the Fraser clan were wiped out. So that part of the history I really relate to, and I think it's great that they decided to tell that story. So I can't fault them, and it's brilliant that Scottish people are employed in Cumbernauld at that studio.
Yeah.
You know, that is a brilliant development, and I just hope it continues. I know that there have been difficulties in keeping the show going just for that reason, because it's hard to, you start overwriting things and it's then fans get annoyed because they've heard that story before. So I think it might be difficult for them to keep sustaining it. Yeah. But then again, maybe they will, you know, it'd be good. Yeah. I think it's very good for Scotland. Any films that people can get funded from Creative Scotland, if they can, or any other bodies, if they're able to meet the criteria, that's brilliant. It's just very hard to make films. You know, you can't just press a button and it all happens. You've got to take time to get right people involved.
And I mean, if you've got a really good story, if that's what grabs people's attention, the folk who've maybe got the money or, you know, the skills, really, that. And I mean, it's just intriguing, isn't it, to think that there's maybe quite a lot of really good stories about that have happened, actual things that have happened in Scotland, and that that haven't made it yet to any kind of screen. Never mind the big screen. There's so many stories. I mean, I'm of that generation, Mary, that didn't get taught any Scottish history at school. Now, the time my daughter was in school, they did get a bit, not a lot, but a bit. So anything I know, I've just picked up out of interest myself, and the more we could do to make it stories like that more widely known in a form that kind of isn't too demanding in a certain way, because we all like watching a good film, don't we?
Yes.
It's not like having to go to the library and get a book out or a history book of some sort. But so let's hope that you carry on doing it. And so you were saying at the very beginning that you're looking for places to maybe have showings of the Red Rose. Yeah.
Yeah, and people are not saying no. They're saying yes. So I'm hoping the next one will be at Catstrand in Galloway, which is they're an art gallery but also a theatre, and they want to screen it in Robert Burns Night 2025. So I'm lucky really, because I think I'm going to sort of extend the anniversary a little bit. It took me in surprise. I didn't realise the interest in it when they screened it at the Theatre Royal. And it's now I realise, well, I should get on the bandwagon because it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And it lets people know that I'm still alive and kicking after 20 years. But aside from that, also, there is public interest. So I'm writing to lots of the arts centres, and if you're able to get it out to them as well, or anybody who's listening who wants a special screening for just all of the reasons we've outlined about the history of things, or maybe they have a connection with Robert Burns. Unfortunately for me, last year I was able to help Palm Tree, which is the company that I've worked with Robbie with, distribute Nessie, the film, and it ended up into 10 cinemas. So I'm hoping to sort of revisit some of the cinemas and ask them and just say, well, what do you think? Would you like a screening of it either before Christmas as part of this anniversary year, or would you like to do it next year again? And what is very interesting is that the Theatre Royal, technically, although I'm involved in trying to get the minutiae, I think they will screen it again on the 21st of July, which is the anniversary of Robert Burns' death next year. And I was anxious to say to them, well, they, Palm Tree or me as the writer would give them the rights to screen it in perpetuity every year for their funds, rather than us making money out of it, because the theatre is associated with Robert Burns. So I'm in the middle of trying to negotiate that properly and get them to write it down. I've had a verbal that yes, they want to screen it next year. And of course that would mean we'll do it all over again, which I'm excited about, because I think it should have been screened every year on the 21st of July. And because the theatre is extending their tours and the story about Robert Burns there is part of the history, I think that's all power to the elbow. So if I can do something to support them, and if the film tickets can help them with their stuff, that's great. So I've got plans for Robert Burns, and I'm looking for other cinemas to take it on for next year too.
When sometimes it's a small cinema, so there's a showing of a film, and then someone, in this case, this would be you, I'm thinking, who obviously was part and parcel of getting it underway and producing it and creating it, is there afterwards just to talk a bit about it for a question and answer. I mean, people really like that. And you've obviously got stories that you can tell that partly they're maybe to do with making the film, but they're also maybe to do with the subject matter as well. So hopefully that happens, and good luck with it.
Well, I'd like to offer that too. genuinely with Robert Burns. I do know about him. And actually, I taught it for 2 years at the Lifelong Learning Department in Strathclyde. So I have a whole
Right.
course
Yeah.
on Robert Burns. But
Even
if you like the alternative, Robert Burns.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Documentary series.
Honestly, you can see I can talk for an hour about Robert Burns. You can't stop me, is the problem.
We certainly enjoyed talking to Mairi, and we hope she enjoyed talking to us.
Absolutely. And if there's any other budding Scottish filmmakers out there with a movie to plug or wanting to come on and talk to us about their experiences, do that, because we're really interested in contemporary Scottish culture, as well as our history, as well as activism, as well as independence.
Yeah, get in touch.